Okay, well, I suppose I had quite a conventional background going to business school at Wharton in my early 20s, and after that I joined the Boston Consulting Group as a so-called strategy consultant. This was the great new invention of the time, looking at the economics of businesses and trying to decide how they could get competitive advantage. And I did that until they fired me, almost fired me. I managed to resign just before they actually did fire me. And I joined another strategy consulting firm called Bain & Company. And Bain & Company and BCG are now two of the three largest consulting firms of their sort during the world, the other one being McKinsey. And Bain & Company were stupid enough to make me a partner pretty quickly. And then three of us spun off and founded LEK. So there was a Lawrence, there was an Evans, and there's a Koch, or was a Koch. And we had a very fortunate time in the 1980s when a lot of European companies were looking at how they should reorganize themselves and how they should restructure themselves to focus on their core markets and so forth. And after 6 years, I decided that I'd had enough of working very, very long hours. And so I retired at the great age of 39. Then couldn't find anything much to do. And then eventually I decided that I would do a combination of writing books about business and ideas and also investing, trying to use those ideas, very unusual for a venture capitalist or a private equity person to actually base the whole of the investment program on whether or not the business was what we call a star business, that is a leader in a high growth market. And that has proved to be, amongst many disasters, quite a successful strategy. As you know, investing is one of the greatest businesses that there is because you can be wrong most of the time. But if you're right about one or two very successful firms, then you can make a lot of money. So anyway, that was my ambition. That's what I've been doing. I'm a great believer in not working very hard. One of the other things that I believe in, apart from BCG's growth share matrix, is the 80-20 principle, which I've written a book about, and that says that you basically achieve most of what you do achieve in a relatively small proportion of your time. And so I have always tried to work pleasantly and to work on things that I'm interested in. One of the things that I'm most curious about and have always been curious about is, why are some people successful? How is it that some people have extraordinary success and great impact on the world, and yet if you look very carefully, if you know the people involved, or if you look very carefully at the sources and the history books and all the rest of it, it's very often people who are not particularly competent, not particularly hugely gifted, although some people who are very successful are, but somehow they manage to be successful, and that has intrigued me. And that's what led me eventually to write the book that we're talking about, Unreasonable Success and How to Achieve It. And so what I did was to try and identify some common characteristics of people who I thought were, in a way, more successful than they deserved. And I started with about 20, 30 potential reasons for that success, and eventually I narrowed it down to 9. And the most curious thing is that of the cases that I looked at, of people who'd had a terrific impact on the world in one way or another, nearly all of them had all of these 9 characteristics, and that's what I wrote the book about.
And can you tell me which individuals you studied to discover these principles, and why were they chosen?
Why were they chosen? It was pretty subjective. They were people that I knew had been very successful, either because I'd known them personally in a few cases, or because I'd studied them as a historian, as an undergraduate historian, or they were people that I had come across in the business world or knew about because of their success in business, or in some cases their success in other fields. I mean, Nelson Mandela was one of those people, and I happened to be living in South Africa at the time that he attained the presidency, and so he was, I knew quite a lot about him. I knew a lot of people who knew him. I was quite lucky to know F.W. de Klerk, who was his predecessor and his deputy president and his mentor, in fact. So there were people that I had come across and I knew had achieved a great deal, and I knew something about them, so that when I read about them, I think I could get a pretty good fix on why they'd been successful and why they hadn't been successful. So it was quite subjective. It was just based around people that interested me or people that I knew something about.
And how many individuals do you think have sort of applied the 80-20 principle? Do you think any of the individuals you studied were sort of workaholics, more on the workaholic side?
Actually, that wasn't a character. I did look at that, Stephen, and it was very interesting that I had the hypothesis that actually they would tend to be people who were like me, and in fact had focused on the 80-20 principle and weren't particularly hard-working, but that wasn't the case. It was a case probably in about half of the people, but the other half of people were very, very hard-working. So that criterion went into the waste paper basket. Another one which I was very fond of was that they would be people who had taken high risks. But actually, when I looked at it, it was only true in, I think, about 40% of the cases. About 8 of the people the 20 people that I studied actually had taken very high risks, and some of them had not.
And from your studies, what do you think were sort of the main key principles that all these individuals followed?
Well, the 9 of them that are listed in the book I can go through, but one of the ones which I came up with, which I don't think anyone else has actually identified, is that they all had a transforming experience of one sort or another at a certain stage in their career. And for Mrs. Thatcher, for example, she'd been Prime Minister, and not a very successful Prime Minister, for 3 years. And then the worst thing happened to her. It was the worst moment of her life when Pinochet invaded the Falkland Islands, and that actually was for her transforming experience, because before that she'd been a rather pedestrian person who was reasonably successful, not unreasonably successful. She was someone who actually had knuckled down, and she'd cultivated the right people. She'd been quite a successful junior minister. She was someone who was quite popular with the grassroots and so on and so forth. But she became Prime Minister almost by accident, because she was the only person who would take on Ted Heath, who was profoundly unpopular because he was so gratuitously rude to his people. And she managed to win. But when she became Prime Minister, she had not really been very successful. In fact, she was almost the most unsuccessful Prime Minister. You remember the Labour Isn't Working campaign in 1979. Well, she implied that in fact she could deal with unemployment, but unemployment, I think, was 750,000 when she took over, and after 2 or 3 years it had gone up to something like 2 million. Inflation had gone up, growth had gone down, recession had come, a lot of businesses had gone bankrupt, and it did seem that she was slated to lose the next election, which would be in 1983, possibly. Yes, it would have to have been in 1983, and and then of course you got the formation of the Social Democratic Party with Roy Jenkins and the Gang of Four, who went to 50% in the opinion polls, and it looked as though Mrs. Thatcher would be turfed out of office. In fact, very, quite likely that she would be thrown out of office by her own party before the election came. And then the Falklands came, and I take nothing away from Mrs. Thatcher, because it's very, very unlikely that any man in that position, particularly if they'd been in the Second World War or had known people who had been in the Second World War, would actually ever have contemplated what the US Navy called a military impossibility to retake the islands. But Mrs. Thatcher thought otherwise, and she gambled her whole career on a very unlikely prospect of retaking the Falklands. As you know, war is a very dicey business, and she was willing to take that risk, and miraculously, almost miraculously, it actually came off. Alongside that, she was very firm while the task force was sailing that it took 6 weeks for them to get to the Falkland Islands. She was very clear that she would not allow any compromise with Argentina, which was pretty much almost forced upon her by the Americans. But she resolutely resisted any idea of joint sovereignty or anything like that. She had to pretend to be reasonable, but she had to also be very, very firm. And it was a virtuoso performance. You wouldn't have thought that she had it in her to do that. But once the islands had been retaken, it completely transformed her political prospects, because the people who were undermining her, basically the wets, the left wing, as it were, of the Conservative Party, were completely and utterly mesmerised by her success there. And as you know, she then pursued some very controversial policies, which did make a huge difference to Britain, whether you like them or not. And she was a very, very successful Prime Minister, until of course she was thrown out of office through overconfidence. But that was a transforming experience for her. And in business, if you look at Jeff Bezos, all of his success was based upon Amazon, and Amazon actually had been blueprinted in the firm that he worked for before, which was called D.E. Shaw and Company, Desco, founded by a computer scientist called David Shaw. And David Shaw engaged Jeff Bezos when he was 26 years old, and the two of them got on like a house on fire. And their principal idea, or David Shaw's principal idea, was that nobody understood that the internet would be so important for retailing, except David Shaw. And that was his view, and it was pretty accurate, actually. He realized that this was going to happen, and he got Jeff Bezos to work on this project, which really developed the blueprint for Amazon in its entirety. And not only did they decide that they were going to be what they called the everything store, but they also decided that books would be the first category that they would enter, and they also decided that they would get people to write reviews on the site and so on and so forth. And at a certain point, Bezos went to David Shaw and said, I know you want me to do this within Desco, but I actually want to do it on my own. And again, astonishingly and very generously, David Shaw, after taking Bezos round a walk in Central Park for a couple of hours, said, I'll let you decide whether or not you're going to do this. He didn't even ask for a share in the company. It was just remarkable. And then Bezos went off and did Amazon. But we would not have heard of Bezos, and he would not be one of the richest people in the world, were it not for the fact that he'd worked for this other company, D.E. Shaw and Company. And similarly with Bill Bain, one of the other people, the founder of Bain and Company, if he had not met Bruce Henderson, because he was the development officer for the university that Henderson had gone to, he would never have been offered the chance to be a major player in the Boston Consulting Group. He had no business background, he had no MBA, he didn't understand economics. He was a historian, and he'd been a research historian, and then jacked that in and decided that perhaps he'd be a development officer instead. And his transforming experience was working in BCG, and then of course he decided to do the dirty on Bruce Henderson and start his own firm, and he took a third of the staff of BCG, who were making probably about 3/4 of the profit in BCG, and then he went away and founded a completely different firm using the same ideas but in a completely different way. And so his transforming experience was also working in a very unique firm who knew something that nobody else did. And that was quite a common theme for the business people, that they had this experience of working in another company, which was a transforming experience. And so you had some other pretty odd transforming experiences. For example, Lenin's transforming experience was knowing that his elder brother had been hanged by the Tsar for an alleged attempt on his life. And that turned this very cheerful schoolboy into a totally determined and vitriolic person who absolutely wanted to end the Tsarist regime, and whose theory was that it was amazing that the Tsars and their hangers-on, who were a very small number of people, should be able to rule a country like Russia. And he said, why not us? If I can have a group of very determined revolutionaries who are totally loyal to me and totally ruthless, then we can stage a coup and we can take over this country and we can destroy the incipient democracy which started in 1917. So, it was that very unfortunate experience was what really started him on the path to basically transforming not only Russia, but a large proportion of the world followed the communist route for a very long time. So that, also was, a transforming experience which was very, very unusual. Nelson Mandela's transforming experience was going to Johannesburg from a rural backwater and getting involved with the ANC there, which was, quite remarkable. And, also, if you look at the transforming experience that the transforming experience of Viktor Frankl was being sent to Auschwitz and other concentration camps by Hitler, and deciding there and then that he had the freedom to outlive Hitler. That was his objective in the camps, and to write the book which he was going to write, which he thought was the third wave of psychology, about existential freedom and about meaning, the importance of meaning in people's lives. And he decided that what he would do when he went to the concentration camps, they took all his possessions away. They took the draft of the book that he was going to write. Well, what he did was to copy down on little bits of paper or scraps of cigarette packets or whatever the ideas that he had, so that he didn't forget them. And then he saw himself as lecturing on the same themes after he had left the concentration camps, assuming that this whole apparatus of evil would be wiped out. And lo and behold, that happened. That was his transforming experience. So one of the things which I think is very important for anyone, if they really want to be unreasonably successful, more successful than in a way any of us deserve, because I think success is, it's an astonishing privilege, but it's also astonishingly a function of luck. But if you want to move the odds in your favor, you've got to make sure that you have a transforming experience. And that's one of the things that I'm very interested or an evangelist for, because I think we do need more creative people. We do need people who have more of an impact on the world. and that one of the ways that you can do that is by making sure that you had a transforming experience. The transforming experience that the 20 people I write about in the book had were not self-engineered, they just happened to them. But one of my themes is, if you can actually look at what happened to these other people, then in fact you can sort of copy what happened to them, even though they themselves did not know that a transforming experience was very important. We do. And so we can say, well, I always say to someone in their 20s, who's interested in making an impact on the world, have you had a transforming experience? I explain what a transforming experience is. Most of them haven't. And then I explain some of these case studies and say to them, well, if you want to be incredibly successful, you've got to acquire a unique mission or a unique knowledge. And the best way of doing that is to find a person or an organization that knows something that nobody else knows, and go and work there for a time, and then work out your own different but similar, if that's not a contradiction, an oxymoron, way of doing it. Because you can't ever be successful by being a pale imitation of someone else, but you can take ideas that someone has proven to be very, very powerful and apply them in a different context. A good example of that is BCG worked out, I believe, one of the most incredibly powerful ways of being successful is to have a star business, a business which becomes the leader or is the leader in a high growth market. Well, they applied that in consulting by advising people to do that. Bill Bain not only did that, but he also said, well, why can't we use these ideas to help us make venture capital and private equity investments and back the companies that we think are star businesses or have the potential to be star businesses. And in Bain Capital's first 10 years, they actually increased their assets under management by 100% a year. And that must be true because they issued a prospectus saying that it was true, and the lawyers had been through it and all the rest of it. It was quite extraordinary performance, and indeed they've continued to be. Not obviously, no one can do that for very long, otherwise they'd own the whole world. But it is just extraordinary that you can take a very powerful idea that you really believe in, because unless you've had the experience of working in a firm like BCG or Bain & Company in the early days, where it's so exciting because it's new and you do know something that other people don't know, and it does make money one way or another, unless you've actually had that experience, you won't believe it. Because you tell people, well, actually, we could have 100% returns for 5 years or something like that. They just won't believe it. And of course, you can't continue at that rate. But you don't have to continue at that rate, because anyone that can invest and compound money at 20% a year is one of the very best investors in the world. And I know that it can be done by investing in star businesses.